All right, welcome everybody to The Burden of Credibility, 1960 to 1968. This is the video lecture now that follows on the heels of the Birth of the Cold War lecture, and we'll break it into two parts. Part one is the Kennedy years, the early 1960s, and part two will then follow on that through the Lyndon Johnson years and the rise of the Vietnam War. We begin today with the burden of JFK, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, a young president elected by a narrow margin in 1960 to lead now the United States into the new decade and along its path of the Cold War. Kennedy, in addition to being one of the youngest of America's presidents, was also perhaps, I think, understood by many to be one of its least experienced. He had served a term in the U.S. Senate, but most Americans, even those who voted for Kennedy, were not terribly aware, I think, of who this man was or what he might become now as President of the United States. In giving his inaugural address in January of '61, Kennedy made it clear that what he would be is a stalwart defender of the what the Americans like to call the free world. That is the defender against the growth of international communism. And he made no bones in his inaugural speech, the famous inaugural speech that had him saying, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," one of the best known presidential speeches of the 20th century. But in that speech, the entire text was given over to Cold War foreign policy. "Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, in order to assure the survival and the success of liberty." This was a bold statement. The promise to bear any burden, meet any hardship, oppose any foe. It was clear that he was talking about the communist world, and that despite his youth and his relative inexperience, he was prepared now to see America maintain its word. The word that had been issued by President Truman and then by President Eisenhower. In fact, it was during Eisenhower's term that this promise to somehow contain the growth of international communism was ratcheted up. The so-called Eisenhower Doctrine, delivered in a speech to Congress in 1957, had asked Congress to authorize such assistance and cooperation to include the employment of the armed forces of the United States to secure and protect the territorial integrity and political independence of such nations requesting such aid against overt armed aggression from any nation controlled by international communism. In the red letters here we see the critical piece: the employment of the armed forces of the United States. Not even President Truman had made that promise. It was supplies, yes, money, weapons, yes, but not until Eisenhower publicly avows America's willingness to send troops, potentially, to the hotspots, the global hotspots, where communist aggression would be checked. Not until Eisenhower makes the promise had America gone quite so far. And here he is shown meeting with President Diem of South Vietnam, one of those global hotspots, a place under siege, seemingly, by a communist expansion. Eisenhower's containment strategy was built around covert operations. Ike sought to avoid what he called the noisy trumpeting of media and politicians that came with conventional military action. America's interests would be defended now by our own special forces, that is, specially trained, specially recruited forces from our military and our CIA, who could join up with other native groups, be they Korean or Vietnamese or what have you, fighting against communism, often in guerrilla style, unconventional warfare, to check the influence of communist expansion. The virtue of it being covert, of course, was that it would not open itself up to public debate. Now, this was the plan as the Eisenhower team had conceived it in regard to Cuba and what came to be known as the Bay of Pigs operation in 1961. Here you see Fidel Castro, the young revolutionary leader of Cuba who had recently overthrown a U.S.-backed government there. Almost from the beginning, Castro was a thorn in the side of American foreign policy, threatening more than just our containment, but our much older promise to keep the Western Hemisphere somehow free of foreign interference. You see, because though Castro himself is of course a Cuban, the U.S. simply assumed that with a leftist regime now in Cuba that the Soviet Union would be quick to exploit the opportunity to establish itself. Remember, a country only 90 miles from our own shore. So yeah, the Eisenhower folks set about concocting a counter strike, training mostly Cuban expatriates who had fled Castro's regime on a secret military base in Nicaragua, and preparing them for what would be an invasion of the island. An invasion that would not happen until Kennedy's term, however. The Eisenhower people had simply run out of time before Ike left office, but carried it forward to the Kennedys, making their pitch to President Kennedy to approve this mission. And Eisenhower weighed in personally on this with John Kennedy. And Kennedy, despite some misgivings, you might say, nevertheless gave the go-ahead. And of course, famously, it was a almost total disaster. Castro's forces simply overwhelmed the invading force. The promised air support by the U.S. Failed to materialize, and in the end, scores of Cuban counter-revolutionaries under the U.S. auspices, scores were killed and hundreds were taken prisoner in what was now an embarrassing and really humiliating setback for President Kennedy. Kennedy owned up to it, however, going on national television and saying, "I will take the defeat and I'll take all of the blame for it." But privately, he was burning. He was outraged that such a humiliating failure could happen so early in his watch. It was only April. He had only been inaugurated in January. And to understand why this was such a bitter personal defeat for John Kennedy, we have to understand where it is that this young man had come from. That is, growing up Kennedy now gives us a kind of a background view of the presidency of John Kennedy. John Fitzgerald Kennedy was born in 1917, the second son of his father and mother, Joe and Rose Kennedy. His older brother, Joe Jr., had preceded him, and the two of them really sort of represented now a new generation of confident, outgoing, and wealthy Irish Catholic Americans. The story of the Irish in America had been a story of working class people, working class immigrant people who often faced the anti-Irish discrimination and scorn of the native Anglo populations, particularly in a town like Boston. But Joe Kennedy, the father, Joe Kennedy growing up, was determined to overcome all of that, and through a kind of tenacity and ambition and ruthlessness in business, Kennedy had made himself a very wealthy man and had provided for all the material wants of his growing family, a family that included not only the two boys, but a whole host of brothers and sisters to come. For the Kennedys, it is the shithouse or the castle, Joe Sr. liked to say, nothing in between. And so it is that sort of winner-take-all ethic that he passed on to his boys, both of whom were now involved in America's great war in World War II. The younger brother, John, a Navy lieutenant officer, commander of a patrol boat in the South Pacific. Older brother, Joe, an Army air pilot. And even though it was Joe Jr., I think, who the father often saw as the heir apparent, the son whose career he wished to cultivate ultimately in public service, and let's face it, the ultimate prize in American politics, the presidency. That was not to happen because it was, first of all, the younger brother John who distinguished himself initially with his heroics as skipper in what came to be known as the PT 109 incident. It's something, if you care to, you can read a bit more about. While older brother Joe, volunteering for what was a heroic, nearly suicidal mission, even in execution, was tragically killed in an accident involving the piloting of his plane, and thus did not live to see the end of the war, leaving his younger brother now, in effect, the oldest Kennedy son, which meant that he inherited the father's ambition that had been for his brother Joe to become now the leader of the Kennedy family in the public eye. And it didn't take long for Joe Kennedy to begin grooming his son's political career. In 1946, he had John run for a congressional seat in the old Boston neighborhood. Keep in mind that JFK didn't himself grow up in the Boston Irish neighborhood. He grew up in palatial splendor in the family mansion in New York. But his political career would now reconnect the family to Boston, and his victory in 1946 would begin now a storied political dynasty, if you will, for the Kennedy family. You look at this picture here of JFK, and keep in mind now that in 1946, he is, he's 29, almost 30 years old, and yet to look at him, he's, his boyish appearance, he could have been almost a teenager at this time, and part of that had to do with the fact that for much of his life up to this point, John Kennedy had not been healthy, had not been well, physically well. He suffered from a malady that involved intestinal disorder, one that was quite serious and often left him really unable to absorb the nutritional value of the foods that he would eat, and leaving him often, rather thin and even gaunt in his appearance. And what was worse is that the treatment that doctors pursued for Kennedy's ailment had bad side effects and led to a degenerative back condition. And so young John Kennedy was not a healthy person, but suffered from medical maladies that the family typically shielded from the public. There would never be a full acknowledgement of the true extent of Kennedy's health problems until long after his death. So here he was, looking, really young in 1946. But that would change because the old man, Joe Sr., was determined to see his boy develop accordingly as a formidable political figure. It was his marriage to Jackie Bouvier in 1953 that seemed to establish the next sort of step in his political career. Among other things, and you can tell from the picture now, that his health problems had been remedied to some extent. He had been able to put on weight and to look altogether much healthier. And to look like the United States Senator from Massachusetts that he had become. His beautiful, cultivated, sophisticated wife completed the picture now of the Kennedys as a political couple to be reckoned with. And by 1960, the father had determined it was time to make the grab for the gold ring, that is, to run for the presidency. So Kennedy for president in 1960. A campaign bankrolled by his father's wealth, going up against a better-known, more experienced opponent in Richard Nixon. Nevertheless, pulling off a narrow victory, some 128,000 votes out of more than 69 million cast. I think it was the growing popularity of the Kennedys, of JFK, his wife, Jackie. There hadn't been a young, vivacious, sort of stylish First Lady in many, many years in the White House, and I think the rather youthful element of our country, the post-war generation of our country, really responded strongly to this image of youthful vitality and style and grace. And the Kennedys were quite adept at developing this public image. Even during the campaign, the first of the televised presidential debates in American history were held, and famously, John Kennedy appeared cool, calm, in control, informed, and altogether presidential, while his opponent, Richard Nixon, battling a recent blood infection and an unfortunate tendency to sweat under the television lights, appeared less composed, although those who listened on the radio seemed to think the debates were evenly split. Those who watched on TV, and a growing number now would turn to TV to learn about their candidates, seemed to give Kennedy the edge. So an ability to manage images, manage media, was something that the Kennedy team proved itself very skilled in doing. And yet, the old expression that you have to be careful what you wish for, lest it come true. The burdens of a young president, now elected, facing what I think must be one of the most burdensome tasks, that of a new president. Kennedy had boasted, of course, that the torch had been passed to a new generation of Americans, and he was now the face of that new generation. Let all our neighbors know, he said, that we shall join with them to oppose aggression or subversion anywhere in the Americas. So again, making strong boasts and trying to meet the burdens of a Cold War presidency. You see, 1961, his first year in office, did not go well for Kennedy. Not only was there the Bay of Pigs fiasco, there was a humiliating meeting with President Khrushchev of the Soviet Union, Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union in Vienna, Austria. There was the beginning of what would become the Berlin Wall in Berlin, Germany. In other words, a number of potential conflicts involving the Kennedy people with communists. But in October of '62, American spy planes recorded the building of a missile launch site on the island of Cuba. A missile launch site that was quickly recognized as a nuclear launch site. What came to be known as the October Missile Crisis then galvanized the public's attention. As the Washington Post headline says here, Kennedy orders blockade of Cuba as Reds build nuclear base there. U.S. will sink Defiant arms ships. This was the nuclear brink that everyone had been so afraid of. The Soviet Union, with plans to establish a nuclear arsenal in Cuba, would now have to face an ultimatum by the U.S. and its young president to turn their ships around, to dismantle the nuclear hardware, and to leave Cuba effectively alone. And after several tense days of heated negotiation, a time in which I think the world more or less held its breath, in the end, the Soviets agreed to back down. As one administration official put it, the other guy blinked. So Kennedy had won not only a reprieve from the likelihood of a nuclear confrontation with Russia, but had won now a great measure of a public relations victory, you might say, having overcome the earlier embarrassing defeats, gaining back some of the momentum. And there was that issue of Berlin, Germany, of course. Germany itself divided in the Cold War between a communist East Germany and a non-communist West Germany, a country divided, but a capital city also divided. The traditional capital of Berlin was itself divided between a communist East and a non-communist West. And it was in Berlin that the Soviets had become increasingly concerned with the flow of refugees from the communist East into the non-communist West, an embarrassing stream, you might say, of people who seemed fed up with living under a communist system. Khrushchev was anxious that somehow the United States might interfere in what he considered to be the communist affairs of the East, and had threatened Kennedy that should the U.S. try to interfere, there would be war. Well, in the end, there wasn't war, there was a wall, and the wall was built by the communists to contain that flow of refugees, in effect to keep people from leaving. And one of the videos that I post online is Kennedy's Berlin Wall speech, which refers directly to this idea that the wall was really created to prevent people from leaving the communist East. Kennedy decided to take advantage of what he saw as another opportunity to confront the Soviets by delivering his Berlin Wall speech in 1963, June of 63. All free men, he said, wherever they may live, are citizens of Berlin. And therefore, as a free man, I take pride in the words, Ich bin ein Berliner. In other words, I'm a Berliner. Identifying with the cause of the people of West Berlin, the non-communist half of the city, which, as you can see from the picture there, was just absolutely jam-packed with German people coming to hear Kennedy's speech. And this show of solidarity. Don't be fooled by the sort of wives' tale of Kennedy saying, I'm a Berliner, and being ridiculed because at the time there was a popular breakfast treat in Berlin known as the Berliner, and it sort of became fashionable in later years to say that Kennedy hadn't somehow not taken seriously because, in effect, he was, so the story goes, so the joke goes, calling himself a breakfast pastry. That completely misses the point that not only the people in West Berlin perfectly understood what he meant, but that Germans throughout West Germany, and in fact others across Europe and elsewhere, understood that this American president was declaring solidarity with the free people of Berlin. This was a kind of high point for the Kennedy presidency. He had found his measure. He had found his rhythm, you might say, as a Cold War president. He returned home to the United States in June, and on the 11th gave what became the most important domestic speech of his presidency, the Civil Rights speech of June 11th. And I've also posted this online so that you can hear Kennedy's really pretty moving address. We preach freedom around the world, and we mean it, he said, and we cherish our freedom here at home. But are we to say to the world, and much more importantly to each other, that this is the land of the free, except for the Negroes, that we have no second-class citizens except Negroes, that we have no class or caste system, no ghettos, no master race, except with respect to Negroes. Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise. This was a bold move by Kennedy. He had been reluctant up to this point to take too public a stance in support of the civil rights movement for the same reason that FDR had been reluctant. In other words, the stalwart core of the Democratic Party was still the solid white Democratic South. Kennedy, as a Northerner, was reluctant to see that support alienated by his championing the rights or the civil rights movement. But things had reached a point in this country by 1963. Protests led by Martin Luther King, efforts to desegregate the school system in the South, and other efforts to address civil rights. That Kennedy really couldn't any longer be silent, and so his speech was boldly in support of the civil rights efforts. Now, ironically, it was that boldness that won Kennedy a certain enmity on the part of white Southerners, which was not unexpected, but which his advisors feared could jeopardize his chances for re-election. And so the decision was made to almost immediately undergo a kind of campaign makeover, beginning in Dallas, Texas, with a highly publicized visit to Dallas that he and the First Lady Jacqueline would make. And it was that trip to Dallas in November of '63 that would cause this young president his life. The assassin's bullets fired from a military issue rifle, bolt-action rifle, fired by a former Marine Corps sharpshooter named Lee Harvey Oswald, will succeed in snuffing out the life of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And although there has been a limitless fascination with the Kennedy assassination ever since, and no shortage of conspiracy theories that is the best historical evidence that I've seen still holds to the single gunman theory. And although I know that question will never be definitively answered, I think the fascination with it is simply too great. That is a historical matter. The Kennedy presidency was now over. That President Kennedy would be laid in the grave. You see the flag-draped coffin, and what were days of just, almost, anguish, tortuous grieving in this country, would be laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. And thus would begin the next chapter in our story with President Lyndon Johnson. But we'll stop there for now and continue on with that in part 2 of the video lecture.